In the early years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. It was not a battlefield people could see on maps or in photographs. There were no front lines drawn on land. Instead, the war was fought in cold, dark water, far from cities, far from witnesses. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and it decided whether the Allies would survive or starve. Britain depended on ships for food, fuel, weapons, and soldiers. Every convoy crossing the Atlantic carried the lifeline of an entire nation. Germany understood this clearly. If those ships could be stopped, Britain would fall. To do that, Germany sent its most feared weapon into the ocean depths. The U-boat. German submarines hunted silently. They waited beneath the waves, engines quiet, crews listening through hydrophones for the sound of Allied propellers. When they attacked without warning. A single torpedo could tear a ship apart in seconds. Men, women, and children were thrown into freezing water, often with no chance of rescue. Many never even saw what killed them. By 1943, the numbers were brutal. Hundreds of Allied merchant ships had been sunk. Tens of thousands of lives were lost at sea. German submarine commanders became legends inside the Reich. They were celebrated as hunters, as warriors of the deep. Among them were a few names that terrified Allied sailors more than others. One of those names was Werner Henke. Henke commanded the German submarine U-515. He was skilled, aggressive, and deadly. Under his command, U-515 sank 25 Allied ships. More than 600 people drowned when he torpedoed the British troop ship Ceramic in December 1942. To the Allies, Henke was not just an enemy officer. He was a symbol of the nightmare beneath the Atlantic. The United States Navy answered this threat with hunter-killer groups. These were teams of ships and aircraft designed for one purpose only. Find the submarine. Destroy it. One of those ships was USS Pillsbury. Pillsbury was a destroyer escort, small compared to battleships and carriers. She displaced around 1,200 tons and carried 3-inch guns, depth charges, and hedgehog mortars. She was built to hunt submarines, not to fight surface battles. Her crew trained endlessly for one task. Track the enemy. Force him up. Kill him before he kills you. Lieutenant Commander George Castleman had been in command of Pillsbury for 10 months. In that time, his ship had launched dozens of depth charge attacks. They had chased contacts through rough seas and long nights. But they had never captured a submarine. Not one. On the morning of April 9, 1944, that changed. At exactly 11:15 a.m., Castleman stood on the bridge of Pillsbury. The sea ahead was broken suddenly by steel. A German submarine burst through the surface just 700 yards off the starboard bow. It was U-515. Hours of relentless depth charging by Pillsbury and her sister ships had crippled the submarine. Her systems were damaged. She could no longer stay submerged. Forced into daylight, Henke's boat was exposed and vulnerable. German sailors scrambled onto the deck. Some tried to reach their guns. Others jumped straight into the Atlantic. Pillsbury opened fire. Another American ship, USS Flaherty, joined in. Machine gun fire raked the conning tower. Aircraft circled overhead, firing rockets across the water. Within minutes, U-515 was finished. Her bow lifted into the air. Slowly, she slid backward and disappeared beneath the Atlantic. 44 German sailors were pulled from the sea, including Werner Henke himself. One of Germany's most successful submarines was gone. By every traditional measure, it was a perfect victory. But one man watching that morning saw something very different. Captain Daniel Gallery commanded the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and the entire hunter-killer group. From his vantage point, Gallery had watched U-515 remain afloat for nearly 10 minutes before she sank. 10 minutes. To the Navy, those 10 minutes meant nothing. The enemy was destroyed. The mission was complete. That was how sailors were trained to think. But Gallery's mind went somewhere else. In those 10 minutes, a boarding party could have reached the submarine. Code books could have been captured. Enigma cipher machines could have been seized. New torpedoes and secret technology could have been examined. The intelligence value would have been enormous. For years, the Allies had struggled to crack German naval codes. They had made progress, but the Germans constantly changed their settings. A captured submarine could change everything. No American warship had boarded and captured an enemy vessel at sea since 1815. Not since the War of 1812. 129 years had passed. The Navy did not train for boarding actions. There were no manuals. No procedures. No one believed it was even possible. Gallery decided that had to change. He understood the risks. German crews were trained to scuttle their submarines within minutes of surfacing. Sea valves were opened. Demolition charges were set. Equipment was smashed. Code books were burned. Even if American sailors reached the deck, they would be stepping onto a sinking ship rigged with explosives. German commanders were taught one rule above all others. Never let your secrets fall into enemy hands. Death was preferable. Still, Gallery believed the reward was worth the danger. He gave an order that stunned his captains. Every ship in Task Group 22.3 would form a boarding party. Sailors would train to board a German submarine under combat conditions. On their next patrol, they would not just destroy the enemy. They would try to capture one. The task group returned to Norfolk in late April. While the crews resupplied, something unprecedented began. Officers selected their best men. Quiet meetings were held. No announcements were made. Official orders still described routine anti-submarine patrols. But Gallery had secret authorization from the highest levels of naval command. If the chance came, they were to bring one back alive. On USS Pillsbury, Lieutenant Commander Castleman gathered his crew and told them the truth. They had 6 weeks to prepare for a mission no American sailor had attempted in over a century. Some men felt excitement. Others felt fear. All of them understood one thing. The next time a German submarine surfaced, the war might not end with explosions and sinking steel. It might end with American sailors climbing onto an enemy deck, racing against water, fire, and time itself. And somewhere beneath the Atlantic, another U-boat was already moving. When Captain Daniel Gallery gave the order to prepare boarding parties, he was asking his sailors to do something that went against everything they had been trained to believe. For decades, the mission of the United States Navy in the Atlantic had been simple. Find the submarine. Destroy it. Move on. Boarding an enemy submarine was not just dangerous. It was almost unthinkable. German U-boat crews were trained to act fast when forced to the surface. Within minutes, scuttling procedures would begin. Sea valves would be opened to flood the boat. Demolition charges would be armed throughout the compartments. Code books would be destroyed. Sensitive equipment would be smashed with hammers. By the time an enemy ship reached the deck, the submarine would already be dying. Still, Gallery believed speed and preparation could overcome doctrine. On USS Pillsbury, Lieutenant Commander George Castleman began assembling a boarding team. He did not choose the strongest men or the youngest. He chose sailors who could think under pressure, who understood machinery, and who could work in darkness and chaos. At the center of the team was Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David. David was 41 years old, older than most officers aboard. He had joined the Navy as an enlisted sailor and spent 25 years working his way up through the ranks. He was now the ship's assistant engineering officer. He knew how ships stayed afloat. He understood valves, pipes, pumps, and systems. If anyone could stop a sinking submarine, it was him. David had never boarded an enemy vessel. No one in the United States Navy had, not in living memory. But David accepted the role without hesitation. The boarding party consisted of 8 men. There was no manual to guide them. No experienced instructors. Everything they learned would come from imagination, intelligence reports, and trial and error. Training began the moment Pillsbury left Norfolk on May 15, 1944. Every day, David drilled his men on the fantail. They practiced climbing over railings again and again. They rehearsed jumping from a whaleboat onto a moving deck. They timed themselves, pushing for speed but demanding control. A single slip could mean a broken leg or death at sea. They studied photographs and technical drawings of German Type 9 submarines. These boats were large, over 250 feet long, divided into 11 cramped compartments. The layout was unfamiliar. Labels were in German. Controls were placed differently than on American ships. In combat conditions, they would be moving through near darkness, with water flooding in and the deck tilted beneath their feet. The dangers were obvious, but the details made them terrifying. A surfaced U-boat would rarely sit still. Damage from depth charges could jam the rudder, causing the submarine to circle unpredictably. The deck would be slick with seawater and diesel fuel. German sailors might still be aboard, armed and desperate. At any moment, the submarine could dive again, taking the boarding party down with it. Then there were the explosives. German commanders followed strict scuttling protocols. Demolition charges were placed throughout the submarine, in the engine room, torpedo compartments, and control spaces. Once armed, these charges could detonate within minutes. Even if the Americans stopped the flooding, a single missed charge could send the entire boat to the bottom. David estimated they would have no more than 3 to 5 minutes after boarding. In that time, they would need to locate and disarm explosives, close sea valves, and stop any other scuttling measures. All of this would happen inside a sinking enemy warship. The tools were basic. Wrenches. Flashlights. Sidearms. There was no specialized equipment because no one had ever needed it before. While David trained his men, Captain Gallery worked on the larger plan. Throughout the voyage, Gallery held conferences with his destroyer escort commanders. Commander Frederick Hall coordinated the tactical approach. The goal was no longer total destruction. It was controlled violence. If a U-boat surfaced, ships would fire only small-caliber weapons. Enough to force the German crew overboard, but not enough to sink the submarine. Aircraft would strafe the deck to prevent resistance, but pilots were ordered to avoid hits below the waterline. The submarine had to be wounded, not killed. USS Pillsbury had a critical role. She would lower the first boarding party. Castleman positioned his whaleboat crews for rapid deployment. The moment a submarine broke the surface, David and his men would be over the side and racing toward it. There would be no hesitation and no second chances. Intelligence reports suggested German crews could complete scuttling procedures in under 4 minutes. If the boarding party was even 30 seconds too slow, they would die with the submarine. The task group sailed south toward the waters off West Africa. Reports indicated increased U-boat activity near the shipping lanes around the Cape Verde Islands. Aircraft from Guadalcanal flew constant patrols, scanning the ocean for periscopes and snorkel masts. Days passed without contact. The men grew restless. The drills continued, but repetition wore on them. Every procedure had been memorized. Every scenario rehearsed. Now there was nothing to do but wait. On the morning of June 4, 1944, the task group was 150 miles west of Cape Blanco. Captain Gallery ordered a course change toward Casablanca to refuel. It appeared the patrol was ending without action. At 11:09 a.m., everything changed. The sonar operator aboard USS Chatelaine reported contact. Bearing 045. Range 800 yards. A submarine was running submerged, directly toward the escort carrier Guadalcanal. The training of 6 weeks was suddenly compressed into minutes. Chatelaine turned hard to starboard and accelerated toward the contact. 2 Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal dove toward the sea. The pilot spotted the dark shape of a submarine just below the surface. They opened fire, stitching lines of spray across the water to mark its position. At 11:16, Chatelaine dropped her first pattern of depth charges. White columns of water erupted skyward. Oil bubbled to the surface. The submarine had been hit. 6.5 minutes after the first attack, the U-boat broke the surface 700 yards away. She came up bow first, gray hull streaming seawater. Her conning tower was scarred. Her lights were out. Pipes in the engine room were cracked, flooding the interior. Her rudder was jammed, forcing her into a slow, helpless circle. German sailors poured onto the deck. Some tried to reach the guns. American ships opened fire immediately. Machine gun rounds sparked off the conning tower. One German sailor fell dead. The rest raised their hands and jumped into the Atlantic. On the bridge of USS Pillsbury, George Castleman watched the scene unfold. This was the moment Captain Gallery had prepared them for. Castleman gave the order to lower the whaleboat. Albert David and his 8 men were already waiting. The whaleboat hit the water hard and pulled away from USS Pillsbury. Albert David stood at the bow, eyes locked on the circling submarine ahead. The German U-boat was still moving, still alive, wounded but dangerous. Oil spread across the water like black ink. Debris floated everywhere. German sailors thrashed in the waves, shouting for help. David did not look at them. His focus was the submarine. The coxswain steered directly into the U-boat's path. They had to time it perfectly. Too slow, and the submarine would slip past. Too fast, and the boat could be crushed against the steel hull. The U-boat continued circling to starboard, rudder jammed by depth charge damage, moving like a wounded animal that refused to die. The whaleboat cut inside the arc. The gray hull loomed larger with every second. Diesel fuel coated the water. The smell was sharp and heavy. The submarine's deck glistened, slick with seawater and oil. David reached out and grabbed a railing. The metal was cold and slippery. With one pull, he hauled himself onto the deck. His men followed immediately. The submarine rolled beneath their feet, still turning, still settling by the stern. Near the conning tower hatch, a German sailor lay face down, motionless. No other enemy crewmen were visible. They had abandoned ship. David did not hesitate. He climbed through the conning tower hatch and dropped into the submarine. Inside, the world changed instantly. The control room was nearly dark. Emergency lights cast a dull red glow over unfamiliar machinery. Water sprayed from cracked pipes. The deck was tilted at a sharp angle. Somewhere below, seawater rushed in with terrifying force. The Germans had opened the sea valves. The submarine was flooding. David knew they had only minutes. Maybe less. He shouted orders, his voice echoing through steel compartments. His men spread out, moving fast but carefully. They slipped through narrow passageways, crawling over pipes and cables, boots splashing through oily water. One sailor found the sea strainer valve. It was a massive pipe designed to let ocean water into the engine room. The cover had been removed and thrown aside. He located it nearby, wrestled it into place, and screwed it down with shaking hands. The flooding slowed, but it did not stop. Others searched for demolition charges. They were everywhere. 13 charges had been placed throughout the submarine. In the engine room. Near the torpedo compartments. Inside control spaces. Each one was designed to tear the boat apart from the inside. Some of the charges were already armed. David and his men worked by flashlight, crawling through cramped compartments filled with smoke, water, and fuel fumes. They traced wires with their fingers. They pulled detonators. They cut cables. They disarmed timers that were already counting down. Time lost all meaning. The submarine continued to sink by the stern. The aft deck was already underwater. Each minute brought more flooding, more danger. Any mistake would kill them all. Above them, the circling submarine created a new threat. Without steering, the U-boat swung toward USS Pillsbury herself. Castleman saw the collision coming and maneuvered desperately to avoid it. The whaleboat that had delivered David's team was crushed between the two ships. Wood splintered. Metal screamed. 3 compartments aboard Pillsbury flooded from the impact. But the boarding party stayed aboard the submarine. They had stopped the scuttling. The U-boat was wounded, but she was no longer sinking rapidly. At 11:30 a.m., a second boarding party arrived from USS Guadalcanal. It was led by Commander Earl Trocino, the carrier's chief engineer. When he entered the submarine, he found David's men still working, soaked, exhausted, but relentless. They had done the impossible. They had captured a German submarine. Now they had to keep her alive. Trocino was an experienced engineer, a former merchant marine who understood ship systems better than most men alive. Still, nothing had prepared him for this. The Type 9 submarine was larger than he expected, divided into 11 compartments connected by watertight hatches. Every label was in German. Every system was unfamiliar. He crawled through oily bilge water, tracing pipelines by hand, learning how the submarine breathed and moved. The stern was badly damaged. Depth charges had cracked pipes and ruptured tanks. Water continued to seep in through dozens of small leaks. If they could not control it, the submarine would sink within hours. Trocino took command of the salvage effort. He assigned men to specific valves. He identified which pumps still worked and which were dead. He improvised connections between compartments, redirecting water away from critical spaces. Slowly, painfully, the flooding stabilized. While the engineers fought the sea, David's team searched for intelligence. What they found was beyond anything Gallery had hoped for. 2 Enigma cipher machines were discovered intact, complete with their coding rotors. Stacks of code books lay hidden in lockers and drawers. Signal documents. Operational orders. Charts showing U-boat patrol zones across the Atlantic. Nearly 900 pounds of classified German naval material. In the forward torpedo room, they found something even more dangerous. 2 acoustic homing torpedoes. The Germans called them Zonkenig. These weapons used sound to track their targets, locking onto the noise of Allied ship propellers. The Allies had heard rumors of these torpedoes. Now they were holding them in their hands. Above the submarine, Captain Daniel Gallery faced a new problem. The task group was now responsible for a captured enemy warship, 150 miles off the African coast. The submarine could not move under her own power. She was barely staying afloat. And more than 3,000 American sailors had witnessed her capture. If the Germans learned the truth, they would change their codes immediately. Every advantage gained would vanish. The entire mission would become worthless. Gallery ordered absolute secrecy. No radio messages about the capture. No written records in ship logs. The German prisoners, 58 men including their wounded captain, were confined below decks on Guadalcanal. They were forbidden from speaking to anyone. Later that day, new orders arrived from Washington. The submarine was not to be taken to Casablanca. She was to be taken to Bermuda. The journey would cross 2,500 miles of open ocean. Storms, leaks, and exhaustion threatened them at every step. Salvage crews would remain aboard the submarine around the clock. And the timing could not have been worse. Allied forces were preparing to invade Normandy. D-Day was only days away. If German intelligence learned that their naval codes were compromised, the consequences could be catastrophic. The fate of the largest invasion in history now depended, in part, on 8 sailors who had jumped onto a sinking submarine and refused to let go. The captured submarine drifted behind the American task group like a wounded giant. She was alive, but only barely. Pumps ran without rest. Men worked in shifts, sealing leaks, checking valves, fighting exhaustion as much as seawater. Every hour she stayed afloat felt like borrowed time. Captain Daniel Gallery understood that the danger was no longer just physical. It was informational. If Germany learned that one of its submarines had been captured intact, the reaction would be immediate. Naval codes would be changed. Cipher procedures rewritten. Entire communication systems redesigned. The intelligence treasure now hidden inside the submarine would become useless overnight. Gallery issued strict orders. Absolute silence. No radio messages mentioned the capture. Ship logs made no reference to it. Officers spoke only in private, and even then, carefully. The German prisoners were isolated below decks on USS Guadalcanal. They were given medical care and food, but they were forbidden from speaking to anyone outside their guard detail. To the outside world, U-505 had simply vanished. Washington soon added another layer of urgency. The submarine was to be taken to Bermuda, not North Africa. The route was longer, riskier, and more exposed, but the reason was clear. Bermuda offered secrecy. Casablanca did not. The timing was critical. Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of Normandy. D-Day had been planned for June 5, then delayed to June 6 due to weather. If German intelligence suspected that their naval codes had been compromised just days before the invasion, the Allies could lose one of their most important advantages. Every mile toward Bermuda felt like a race against discovery. The tow was slow and dangerous. USS Pillsbury attempted to take the submarine under tow first, but damage from the collision during the capture made it impossible. 3 of her compartments were flooded. She could not handle the strain. USS Guadalcanal rigged a tow line instead. Slowly, painfully, the task group began moving north. Storms battered the damaged submarine. Waves crashed over her decks. Salvage crews remained aboard day and night, pumping water and monitoring cracks that threatened to widen without warning. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. No one relaxed. Not for a moment. Eventually, the fleet tug USS Abnaki took over towing duties. Even then, the danger never faded. One major failure, one broken line, one missed valve, and the submarine would be lost forever. After 15 tense days, the task group entered Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. The submarine was immediately hidden in a remote section of the naval base. She was repainted to disguise her German origins and given a new designation. USS Nemo. Only a handful of officers knew the truth. The German prisoners were transferred to a secret camp in Louisiana. The Red Cross was denied access. Their families in Germany were told they were missing, presumed dead. They would not learn the truth for years. Now the real value of the mission began to emerge. The intelligence materials recovered from the submarine were rushed to Allied experts. The code books alone were priceless. They contained Enigma settings valid for weeks and months. When combined with the captured Enigma machines and rotors, they confirmed long-held theories about German cipher procedures. At Bletchley Park in England, Allied codebreakers went to work. Intercepted German naval messages that had once been unreadable suddenly made sense. U-boat positions appeared on maps. Patrol routes became visible. Supply schedules and rendezvous points were exposed. Convoy commanders changed course to avoid danger. Hunter-killer groups were sent directly toward submarines that believed they were still hidden. The balance of the Atlantic war shifted quietly, invisibly, but decisively. The captured torpedoes proved just as important. American engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington disassembled the acoustic homing weapons piece by piece. They discovered that the torpedoes tracked the cavitation noise created by ship propellers. The louder the sound, the stronger the attraction. The solution was simple, but brilliant. Allied ships began towing noisemakers called foxers. These devices produced louder cavitation than the ships themselves. When German torpedoes were fired, they chased the decoys instead of their targets. Almost overnight, reports from the Atlantic changed. Torpedoes that once hit with terrifying accuracy began missing. German commanders were confused. Some suspected Allied countermeasures, but no one understood how the enemy had learned the secret so quickly. They never suspected a captured submarine. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, reviewed the intelligence haul personally. He understood its value. He also understood the risk. Captain Gallery had taken a gamble of enormous proportions. If secrecy failed, if Germany changed its codes before D-Day, the consequences could have been catastrophic. King approved the results, but his praise was measured. Gallery received the Legion of Merit, along with a private warning. The secret had to hold. It did. The German Navy never learned what happened to U-505. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, received the submarine's final transmission on June 3. She reported her position off the African coast and indicated she was returning to base in Lorient, France. After June 4, there was silence. This was not unusual. By 1944, U-boats disappeared regularly. Allied air power and hunter-killer groups had turned much of the Atlantic into a killing ground. Donitz assumed U-505 had been sunk like hundreds of others. He ordered no changes to German naval codes. The secrecy was complete. More than 3,000 American sailors who had witnessed the capture said nothing. No letters home. No diary entries. Captain Gallery explained the stakes clearly. Loose talk could cost lives. The men understood. Not a single breach occurred. As the summer of 1944 unfolded, the results became undeniable. U-boat losses mounted. German submarines were intercepted before they reached their patrol areas. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with fewer losses than at any point since the war began. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won. But the war was not over. In the final months of the conflict, Germany prepared one last gamble. A desperate operation aimed directly at the American coastline. It would force the Navy to face submarines again, not in distant waters, but near home. And USS Pillsbury would be there. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Allied armies were pushing deep into Germany. Cities lay in ruins. Fuel was scarce. Trained crews were harder to find. Yet the German Navy was not finished. In desperation, Admiral Karl Donitz approved one final gamble. It was called Operation Teardrop. The plan was simple, but dangerous. A group of advanced German submarines would cross the Atlantic and operate close to the American coast. These boats were faster, quieter, and better armed than earlier models. Some were rumored to carry new weapons, possibly even long-range missiles. The goal was psychological. If German submarines could strike ships near New York, Boston, or Norfolk, it would shock the American public. It would force the United States Navy to divert resources away from Europe. Even a small success could delay the final Allied push. American intelligence picked up signs of the operation in late March. Thanks to broken German codes, warnings reached Naval Command quickly. Hunter-killer groups were assembled along the eastern seaboard. Air patrols increased. Shipping lanes were adjusted. The Atlantic became a guarded frontier once again. USS Pillsbury was assigned to one of these defensive groups. The crew understood the stakes. This was not the open ocean near Africa. This was home water. Any failure would be felt far beyond the Navy. In April, contact was made. German submarine U-546 was detected south of Newfoundland. USS Pillsbury, along with destroyer escorts USS Flaherty and USS Nunzer, moved in. Sonar pings echoed through the cold water. Depth charges exploded, shaking the sea itself. U-546 fought back. She fired acoustic homing torpedoes and attempted to slip away in deep water. The battle lasted hours. Finally, the submarine was forced to surface. She was heavily damaged, but still dangerous. The American ships opened fire. After a brief exchange, U-546 sank beneath the waves. Her captain and a small number of crewmen were pulled from the water alive. They were taken aboard as prisoners. Interrogation revealed the truth. Operation Teardrop was real. Several submarines had already crossed the Atlantic. Their orders were to attack without warning and without concern for survival. Germany was willing to sacrifice these crews for one last chance to hurt the enemy. The hunt intensified. Within weeks, the remaining German submarines were tracked down and destroyed. Some were sunk by depth charges. Others by air patrols. None reached their intended targets. Operation Teardrop failed completely. It was the final U-boat operation of the war. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. For the men of USS Pillsbury, the war ended quietly. There were no parades at sea. No speeches. Just orders, routine, and the slow realization that the danger had finally passed. But one secret remained. The capture of U-505 was still classified. Years passed. The submarine itself was eventually shipped to the United States. She was displayed briefly in New York and Chicago as a war trophy. Crowds walked past her steel hull, unaware of how close she had come to changing the course of history. Over time, U-505 found a permanent home at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Visitors see her today resting silently indoors, protected from weather and corrosion. Children climb nearby. Families take photographs. Few understand what they are looking at. This submarine once carried secrets powerful enough to shape a global war. Captain Daniel Gallery lived long enough to see the story declassified. When asked about the capture, he spoke modestly. He credited his crew. He credited training. He credited timing. But history tells a clearer story. Gallery had broken a rule that had existed since the beginning of submarine warfare. He chose capture over destruction. He trusted his men to do something no one had done before. Albert David received the Medal of Honor for his actions aboard U-505. His bravery under pressure became a symbol of courage and calm leadership. Other members of the boarding party received Navy Crosses and Silver Stars. Yet for many years, their achievement remained hidden. Thousands of sailors carried the secret without recognition. They understood why. They had seen what intelligence could do. They had seen how silence could save lives. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a single victory. It ended through countless patrols, quiet decisions, and unseen advantages. The capture of U-505 was one of those moments where everything came together. Luck. Skill. Courage. And silence. USS Pillsbury did not sink the most submarines. She did not fire the most weapons. But she played a role in something far greater than numbers. She was part of a moment when the tide of war shifted, not with an explosion, but with a boarding rope and a decision to take a risk. World War II was filled with massive battles and famous names. But sometimes, the most important victories happened far from cameras and headlines. Deep at sea. Hidden in steel. Carried home in silence.